Imagine this. It's June 3rd, 1942. The morning is cold, brutally, teeth achingly cold. The kind of cold that makes your lungs burn with every breath. You're an American soldier standing on a remote island in Alaska, a place most Americans can't even find on a map. You're looking out at the grey, churning Arctic Ocean. The wind cuts through your uniform like a knife through paper. And then you see them. Japanese warships on the horizon, rising out of the mist like ghosts, their guns turning toward you, the sound of aircraft engines screaming overhead. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the Japanese have invaded American soil. Not Hawaii. That's still a territory back then. But actual mainland North American territory. American citizens are being shot at. American blood is spilling on Arctic ice. But here's what makes your skin crawl even more. Almost nobody knows this happened. This is the story of the Aleutian Islands Campaign, the battle that nobody talks about. The war in the Arctic that shaped the course of World War II changed military strategy forever and proved that America's backyard was far more vulnerable than anyone ever imagined. For nearly 2 years, from 1942 to 1943, this frozen, desolate chain of islands became a battleground. Thousands of men fought and died in conditions so brutal, so unforgiving, that the official reports barely mentioned them. So why is this called the Forgotten Battle? Maybe it's because the real action was happening in Europe and the Pacific. Maybe it's because these islands were so isolated, so hostile, that even reporting the facts seemed impossible. Or maybe it's because what happened here was so shocking, so impossible to believe that America needed to forget it, just to sleep at night. In the next hour with me, you're going to discover the real story, the myths that have buried this campaign. The heroes whose names were lost to history, the tactical decisions that changed everything. And most importantly, you're going to understand why this forgotten battle might be the most important lesson about vulnerability and preparedness that America has ever learned. If you think your country is untouchable, unbeatable, think again. This is the Aleutian Islands Campaign. Section 1. The setting geographical and geopolitical context, U1, 1,400 words. Before we talk about the battle itself, you need to understand where this even happened. And I mean really understand it. Not just geographically, but emotionally, spiritually even. The Aleutian Islands stretch out from Alaska like a broken chain. Over 1,000 islands, most of them unnamed, most of them barely hospitable to human life. They curve southwest from the Alaskan mainland toward Russia. That's right, toward Russia. Bye. During this time, the Soviet Union is fighting Nazi Germany on the other side of the world. But these islands, they're close to Russia. Uncomfortably close. Picture it with me. The islands are volcanic in nature, dark, black, volcanic rock, covered in sparse, stunted vegetation. There are no trees. The wind comes off the Arctic Ocean at 60, 70, 80 miles per hour. It doesn't just blow, it screams. The temperature in winter plummets to 20, 30 below zero. The fog rolls in and never seems to leave. Soldiers who fought there describe it as a place where the sun barely rises in winter and barely sets in summer. It's disorienting. It's maddening. It's a place where your own mind becomes your enemy. The Aleutians are so remote, so forsaken, that most Americans in 1942 barely knew they existed. Alaska itself wasn't even a state yet. It was just a territory, a frozen frontier full of trappers, fishermen, and gold prospectors. The idea that this place could become a strategic theatre of war seemed almost laughable. But then Japan had a very different idea. See, the Japanese military strategists understood something crucial. After Pearl Harbor, America was reeling. Yes, we had recovered. Yes, we were building up our military strength. But there was a window, a brief moment where America's west coast was vulnerable. Japan couldn't invade California. They didn't have the resources, and America's naval power was still too strong. But what if you could establish a foothold in Alaska? What if you could create a base so far from American population centers that you could essentially operate without significant interference? From the Aleutians, Japanese planes could theoretically strike at Canada. They could threaten shipping lanes between America and Soviet Russia. More importantly, they could prove that America was not invincible. They could show that Japanese forces could strike American soil and survive. They could create panic up and down the west coast. The geography made it even more strategic. Alaska is roughly 2,400 miles from Tokyo. But if you're on the Aleutian Islands, on islands like Attu or Kiska, you're much closer. Japan could conceivably fly bombing raids. They could establish supply lines. And here's the kicker, most of the American military establishment in 1942 was focused on Europe. The North African Campaign, the preparation for D-Day, the Pacific War was still ramping up. Alaska, that was considered a backwater, a secondary theatre at best. When the war started, there were barely 5,000 American troops in the entire territory of Alaska. 5,000. To defend an area of 665,000 square miles. The math doesn't work. The geography doesn't work. It was almost like Alaska was defenseless. The Japanese knew this. In fact, let me tell you something that might shock you. There's a direct line between the attack on Pearl Harbor and the invasion of the Aleutians. A planning line. The same Japanese military commanders who orchestrated Hawaii were looking at a map and seeing Alaska. They were seeing opportunity. They were seeing a chance to attack again, to keep America off balance, to prove that the Empire could strike anywhere it wanted. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the man who planned Pearl Harbor, reportedly said that the key to victory against America was to never let them have a moment of rest. Keep them fighting on multiple fronts. Keep them stretched thin. Keep them terrified. The Aleutians were part of that strategy. But what if I told you that the Americans almost didn't respond? That's where this story gets really interesting. You see, when the Japanese made their move on the Aleutians, the initial reports came back to the military command in Alaska and Washington, and there was genuine confusion about what to do. The resources weren't there, the ships weren't there, the troops weren't trained for Arctic warfare, the supplies were limited. There was a real possibility, a genuine, historical possibility that Japan could have occupied those islands and held them indefinitely. If that had happened, everything would be different. The psychological impact alone would have been devastating. Here's America, supposedly the land of the free and the home of the brave, and we've got Japanese troops standing on American soil. I mean, genuine American soil, not just a territory in the middle of the Pacific, and we can't dislodge them. We're stuck fighting a two-front war in Europe and the Pacific, and now we've got a third front on our own doorstep. It would have energized the Japanese people. It would have demoralized the American home front. It would have changed the entire trajectory of the war. But it didn't happen that way. Instead, America responded. Not quickly, not efficiently, not with overwhelming force, but we responded. And that response tells us something profound about American resilience, American adaptability, and American determination during our darkest hour. The question you have to ask yourself right now is this: how did we do it? How did America mobilize to fight a war in one of the most inhospitable places on Earth, with limited resources, uncertain supply lines, and an enemy that had already proven devastating? That's where our story truly begins. Section 2, the invasion operation. Aleutian, 402,000 words, June 3rd, 1942, early morning. The mist is thick off the Aleutian waters. The temperature is hovering just above freezing. The wind is constant. On the island of Midway, about 2,000 miles to the south, American forces are preparing for one of the most crucial naval battles of the entire war. Midway will be a turning point. Midway will cripple the Japanese Navy. But on June 3rd, nobody knows that yet. All anyone knows is that the Japanese are attacking again. This is Operation AL, the Aleutian Islands Campaign from the Japanese perspective. The Japanese assembled a task force specifically for this operation. They had warships, cruisers, and destroyers. They had transport ships loaded with troops. They had aircraft carriers launching planes. This wasn't some small raiding party. This was an organized military invasion, executed by a world-class military force. The primary target was the island of Unalaska, specifically the settlement and military base at Dutch Harbor. Dutch Harbor was one of the only real American military installations in the territory of Alaska. It had docks. It had fuel storage. It had barracks and command centers. It was, in many ways, the nerve center of American operations in Alaska. At dawn on June 3rd, Japanese aircraft screamed out of the clouds and began their bombing run. Imagine you're there. You're a young American soldier, probably 18 or 19 years old, stationed in Alaska because you got unlucky with the assignment lottery. You signed up thinking you'd be in Europe or the Pacific, but instead you're here. You're still in a state that barely seems like part of America. You're cold all the time. The food is bad. The isolation is crushing. And then the sirens start wailing. That sound, that horrible ear-splitting wail that means enemy aircraft are inbound. You've heard it in training. You've never heard it for real before. Your heart starts pounding. Your hands shake. You run for whatever cover you can find. A trench, a building, a bunker. The sky fills with aircraft. Japanese Zeros and bombers. The sky erupts in thunder. Explosions tear through the base. Buildings catch fire. The ground shakes from the concussions. You can hear the machine gun fire ripping through the structures. You can smell the smoke and fuel and burning wood. The Japanese hit Dutch Harbour hard. They destroyed buildings. They damaged fuel storage facilities. They killed American soldiers, men you knew, men you ate breakfast with, men who yesterday were complaining about the cold and the isolation and the terrible coffee. But here's the thing that nobody talks about. It wasn't overwhelming. The American defences at Dutch Harbour actually fought back effectively. I think American anti-aircraft guns engaged the Japanese aircraft. American pilots scrambled and got airborne. The Japanese lost planes. The Japanese suffered casualties. What was supposed to be a devastating, demoralizing blow became something more complicated. The raid on Dutch Harbour lasted roughly 2 hours, and when it was over, the Japanese had proved they could strike the base, but they hadn't destroyed it. The base was damaged, but operational. Fuel storage was intact. The docks were damaged, but repairable. So, what did the Japanese do next? They moved to secure the outer islands. The strategy was clear. Create a foothold further out the Aleutian chain. Establish bases on islands like Attu and Kiska. Use those as launching points for future operations against the mainland and as a buffer against American counter-offensive. On June 6, 3 days after the initial attack, Japanese forces landed on the island of Attu. Now, Attu is one of the most remote, most hostile islands in the entire Aleutian chain. It's roughly 40 miles long and 20 miles wide. The terrain is mountainous, volcanic, rocky, almost impossible to traverse. The weather is chaotic fog and wind and cold, changing moment by moment. There's virtually no vegetation. There's virtually nothing there except rock and ice and hostile weather. But the Japanese came anyway. They came with transport ships. They came with troops, over 2,000 soldiers from the Japanese army. They landed on the southern shore of the island, established a beachhead, and began fortifying their position. They dug in. They built bunkers. They prepared for the inevitable American counterattack. Why Attu? Why not a more hospitable location? Because Attu was strategically positioned. It was at the western end of the American-controlled Aleutians. From Attu, the Japanese could range eastward down the chain. From Attu, they could threaten shipping lanes. From Attu, they could prepare for further operations. But here's what nobody expected. The Americans were already moving. On June 6, the same day the Japanese landed, on Attu, American forces in Alaska were being mobilized. General Simon Buckner Jr., the commander of American forces in Alaska, realized immediately that this was serious. This wasn't a raid. This was an invasion. The Japanese were establishing themselves on American territory and intended to stay. Buckner faced an immediate crisis. He didn't have enough troops. He didn't have enough ships to transport troops. He didn't have enough supplies. He didn't have a clear plan for offensive operations in Arctic conditions. But he knew one thing: he had to respond. Well, he had to drive the Japanese off American soil. What happened next would become one of the most brutally difficult military campaigns of the entire Second World War, and almost nobody remembers it. If you're still here, listening to this, let me ask you something. How many World War II documentaries have you watched that mentioned the Aleutian Islands? Probably none, right? Everyone knows about Pearl Harbor. Everyone knows about D-Day. Everyone knows about Iwo Jima. But Attu? Kiska? These names mean nothing to most people. That's a tragedy. Because what happened on those islands was extraordinary. Section 3. The preparation impossibility of conditions. He must 2,000 dosu 700 words. Now we're going to dig into the real nightmare of this campaign. Not the combat, though. That was horrible. But the conditions, the environment, the sheer, brutal, overwhelming hostility of the place where these men had to fight. Alaska, in 1942, was barely developed. The territory had been purchased from Russia in 1867, roughly 75 years before this war, and it had barely been civilized. There were no roads. There were barely any settlements outside of Anchorage and a few fishing villages. The infrastructure was minimal. The logistics were nightmarish. To fight the Japanese in the Aleutians, the American military had to essentially create an army from scratch in a place where the environment itself was the real enemy. Let's talk about the cold first. Winter temperatures in the Aleutians can drop to 30, 40, 50 below 0 Fahrenheit. That's death cold. That's the kind of cold where exposed skin freezes in minutes. That's the kind of cold where machines fail, where metal becomes brittle and breaks, where metal actually hurts to touch. Soldiers in Arctic conditions need special equipment. Insulated boots, good ones, expensive ones, hard to produce in sufficient quantities, thermal underwear, parka coats. Mittens instead of gloves, because fingers can freeze even inside regular gloves. Goggles to protect against snow blindness. By 1942, America didn't have a well-developed Arctic warfare doctrine. We hadn't seriously fought a war in the Arctic since the Russian Civil War, and that was over 20 years ago. The army had some training manuals about cold weather operations, but practical experience? That was scarce. But it wasn't just the cold. Ooh. It was everything. The Aleutian Islands have some of the worst weather on the planet. The Bering Sea and the Arctic Ocean collide in these waters. The jet stream passes overhead. The weather systems that form there are absolutely catastrophic. You could have clear skies one moment and a whiteout blizzard the next. Visibility could drop from miles to feet in minutes. For military operations, this is devastating. You can't navigate with visibility measured in feet. You can't fly aircraft. You can't coordinate troop movements. Storms in the Aleutians could last for days, weeks even. Soldiers were regularly stranded by weather, cut off from supply lines, unable to move. The fog is unrelenting. One veteran described it as a living thing, not just mist, but something with presence. The fog rolls in off the ocean and it doesn't leave. It blankets the islands. It gets inside your mind. It makes you paranoid. It makes you lose your bearings. Imagine you're on patrol and the fog is so thick you can't see your hand in front of your face. You're walking on rocks. You can't see if the ground drops off in front of you. You can't see if the enemy is 10 feet away. The fog is grey. It's cold. He smells like salt and ice, and he's everywhere. every single day, every single moment. Then there's the terrain itself. The Aleutian Islands are volcanic. The ground is covered in what the soldiers called tundra, though it's not quite the tundra you'd find in Siberia. It's volcanic rock mixed with stunted vegetation, moss, and permafrost. The rock is sharp. It tears boots. It tears uniforms. It tears skin. There are almost no flat places. It's mountains and valleys, ravines and ridges. Every movement is uphill or treacherous. The volcanic rock is loose in places, solid in others. You could be walking along what seemed like solid ground and suddenly drop through into a crevasse. For combat operations, this is a nightmare. How do you coordinate troop movements when the terrain is so difficult? How do you establish defensive positions? How do you transport supplies? How do you treat wounded men when you can't move them easily? The vegetation, what little there is toxic. The plants that grow in the Aleutians are often poisonous or cause severe skin reactions. Soldiers had to be careful where they sat, where they lay down, what they touched. And there's no fresh water readily available. The water sources are often contaminated. Soldiers drank melted ice and snow, which could cause serious digestive problems. Scurvy was a risk, because there were almost no fresh vegetables or fruits. The isolation was psychological warfare. There were no roads. No resupply was easy. To get ammunition, food, fuel, medical supplies, everything had to come by ship. And ships in the Aleutian waters were constantly under threat from storms, from aircraft, from submarines. Supply lines were fragile, unreliable. Soldiers never knew for certain when the next resupply would arrive. One veteran described going weeks with minimal food because a supply ship couldn't get through due to weather. He said the hunger was secondary to the despair. Novril 1-5. The knowledge that you might be stranded, that help might not come, that you could simply be forgotten in this frozen wasteland, that was the real killer. The psychological impact on young men, teenagers, and men in their early 20s was profound. Many soldiers began showing signs of what we'd now call PTSD, even before serious combat. The environment itself was traumatizing. The isolation was crushing. The fear that you die not from enemy bullets, but from exposure or starvation was very, very real. Now, here's where it gets darker. Command knew about these conditions. Buckner's headquarters in Anchorage understood the challenges. But the strategy for the Aleutian Campaign was driven by bigger military politics. The army wanted to demonstrate that it could handle Arctic warfare. The Navy wanted to prove that naval power could be projected into remote areas. The government wanted to show the American people that there was no place Japan could attack, that America couldn't eventually reclaim. Political considerations sometimes trumped practical considerations. Men were being sent to fight in conditions that were borderline unsurvivable, partially because military leadership wanted to prove a point. What if I told you that some of the commanders making these decisions had never actually been to the Aleutian Islands? That's historically accurate. Some of the officers directing the campaign operated from headquarters in Anchorage or Juneau or even Seattle. They were making decisions about terrain and conditions they'd never actually experienced. They were working from maps and reports. Here we're dealing with incomplete information, but they were still sending men out to fight and die in these conditions. By the time the American forces were ready for the major offensive against Attu, the army had assembled roughly 15,000 troops. These troops had some cold weather training, but most of them had never experienced conditions this extreme. They had equipment, sometimes the right equipment, sometimes not. They had supplies, sometimes adequate supplies, sometimes barely enough. They had fear. They had determination. They had no idea what they were about to face. In May 1943, nearly a year after the Japanese invasion, the American offensive against Attu was ready to begin. The plan was straightforward. Land troops on the southern shore of Attu, establish a beachhead, push inland, and eliminate the Japanese garrison. Simple in theory, catastrophically complicated in practice. Section 4, the Battle of Attu. Descent into hell, 2,700, 1,700, 3,000 words, May 11th, 1943. The sun never quite sets at this time of year in the Aleutians. You get twilight, eerie, grey, half-light that lasts almost all night. But you get used to that. What you don't get used to is the cold, the fear, the knowledge that in a few hours you might be dead. American transport ships approached Attu Island in the pre-dawn darkness. They carried thousands of troops, mostly from the US. Army, with some Army Air Forces personnel and Navy support. These weren't elite troops, necessarily. They were soldiers who'd been in Alaska for months, dealing with the cold and the isolation. Some had combat experience from other theatres. Many didn't. The landing began around dawn. The ships deployed smaller boats, Higgins boats. They were called to ferry troops to shore. The Japanese were waiting. Now, you have to understand the Japanese military's tactical doctrine at this time in the war. After a string of defeats in the Pacific, the Japanese army had adopted what they called no-retreat orders. Why? Officers at all levels were instructed that retreat was dishonourable. Death was preferable to surrender. This wasn't just propaganda, it was official military doctrine. The Japanese garrison on Attu had been building defensive positions for nearly a year. They understood the terrain. They'd had time to establish bunkers, gun positions, supply caches. They'd dug in deep. They were ready for a fight to the death. The Americans waded ashore into a nightmare. The landing was difficult. The beach was rocky. The water was freezing. Boats grounded on rocks and reefs. Soldiers had to jump into waist-deep, numbing cold water and wade the final distance to shore. Some men collapsed from the cold shock before they even reached the beach. Their bodies couldn't handle the sudden immersion in Arctic water. As soldiers came ashore, Japanese artillery opened fire, mortars, machine guns, rifles from positions in the hills above the beach. The Americans had expected this, had trained for this, but training doesn't prepare you for the reality of incoming fire. Men fell. Blood mixed with seawater. The beach became chaos. And, the American plan was to establish a beachhead, push inland, and gradually advance toward the main Japanese defensive positions. But the terrain made movement slow. The volcanic rock made progress difficult. Every few hundred yards, Japanese soldiers would be dug into new positions, ready with machine guns and grenades. Imagine what this was like. You're a young soldier. Let's say you're 19 years old. You volunteered or were drafted. You've been trained. You've been trained. You've been in Alaska for months dealing with the cold and the isolation. And now you are on a frozen beach in the Arctic, and people are shooting at you with machine guns. You're trying to move forward, but the terrain is treacherous. Your boots are slipping on wet volcanic rock. Your rifle is cold and stiff. Your hands are numb. In front of you, someone screams. One of your buddies, maybe. Someone you've been eating with, sleeping next to, training with. He's hit. He's bleeding. And there's nothing you can do to help him right now because you're pinned down by enemy fire. This is war. This is the reality of it. Not movies, not history books. The cold, the fear, the smell of blood and gunpowder and burned flesh. The sounds of explosions and screams and machine guns. The first day of the Battle of Attu was a bloody stalemate. The Americans got ashore, established a beachhead, but couldn't push inland in any organized fashion. The Japanese killed hundreds of American soldiers, but the Japanese themselves were taking casualties too. Their supply lines were being cut off. American aircraft and ships were preventing Japanese resupply, slowly strangling them. Over the next 2 weeks, the battle became what historians call a meat grinder. Day after day of combat in impossible conditions. American troops would attack. Japanese troops would defend stubbornly. Men would die. Sometimes the Americans would gain a few hundred yards. Sometimes the Japanese would counterattack and reclaim that ground. The fog never stopped. The weather got colder. Snow fell. Rain fell. The wind howled constantly. Soldiers were dealing with not just enemy combat, but hypothermia, frostbite, dysentery, and something called immersion foot. A condition where prolonged cold exposure causes tissue damage to the feet. Medical personnel were overwhelmed. There weren't enough doctors. There weren't enough medics. Wounded men lay in the snow waiting for treatment. Some died waiting. Some lost limbs to gangrene before they could be evacuated. The psychological impact was profound. American soldiers discovered that their enemy wouldn't surrender. Japanese soldiers would fight until they were killed. There was no negotiation. No, you can live if you put down your weapon. This was a war of annihilation. It was unsettling to young men who'd hoped that war, while terrible, followed certain civilized rules. As the battle dragged on, American commanders realized that the Japanese position was being systematically destroyed. The American strategy was to gradually encircle the Japanese, cutting off their supplies, slowly eliminating them. It was brutal and time-consuming, but effective. By late May, after nearly 2 weeks of fighting, the American advance had pushed the Japanese into a smaller and smaller area. The Japanese garrison, originally over 2,000 strong, was being decimated. Wounded Japanese soldiers were dying from lack of medical care. Healthy soldiers were running out of ammunition, and then something extraordinary happened. On May 29th, 1943, the remaining Japanese soldiers, roughly 1,000 or so, launched what they called a final assault, a banzai charge. They were out of ammunition, they were out of supplies, they were out of hope. So they decided to attack with bayonets and hand grenades in one last, desperate assault. The American soldiers encountered this with shock and horror. Waves of Japanese soldiers running at them, screaming, bayonets fixed to their rifles, grenades in their hands. It was like something from a medieval battlefield, not modern war. The American forces were mechanized. They had machine guns. They had artillery. They had superior firepower. The Japanese charge was slaughtered. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers were killed in that final assault. When it was over, Japanese command on Attu accepted that further resistance was impossible. Some Japanese soldiers committed suicide rather than surrender. This was the code of honor, the way soldiers were supposed to conduct themselves in the face of defeat. On May 30th, 1943, the Battle of Attu ended. The American casualty count was staggering, over 300 dead, over 1,000 wounded. Relatively speaking, American casualties weren't as heavy as they could have been. Modern mechanized warfare did give America an advantage. But in the context of the Aleutian Campaign, these were significant losses. The Japanese garrison was essentially eliminated. Only a handful of Japanese soldiers were taken prisoner. Most fought to the death, true to their military code. The Americans had won, but the cost was terrible, and there was still Kiska. Section 5, Kiska, the island, that wasn't 3,600, 4,300 words. After Attu, there was one more Japanese stronghold in the Aleutians, the island of Kiska, roughly 90 miles to the northwest of Attu. Kiska was strategically even more important than Attu. It had a better harbour. It had more defensible terrain. The Japanese garrison there was supposed to be even larger. Some estimates suggested as many as 10,000 Japanese soldiers on Kiska, ready to fight. American military planners began preparing the next offensive. They would follow the same strategy: naval bombardment, airstrikes, then an amphibious assault. Troops were gathered, ships were assembled. Plans were drawn up. But something strange happened. By July 1943, the American military was processing intelligence reports about Kiska. It seemed like the Japanese were preparing a major defense. Reports suggested increasing Japanese activity. Reports suggested reinforcements were being sent. American commanders were preparing for a battle potentially worse than Attu. The plan was set for August. An invasion force of around 30,000 American soldiers would land on Kiska. It would be the largest operation in Alaska during the entire war. On August 15th, 1943, the invasion began. American ships approached Kiska. American aircraft bombed the island. Artillery barraged the coastline. American troops landed in their Higgins boats, waded ashore, prepared for fierce combat. And they found nothing. The Japanese had evacuated. Through cover of fog and darkness, Japanese forces had withdrawn from Kiska over a week before the American landing. They'd loaded their troops onto fast naval transports and gotten out. The American invasion force found an empty island, destroyed supplies, empty barracks, but no enemy. It was anticlimactic. After all the preparation, all the fear, all the psychological build-up, the soldiers landed on an undefended island. Modern historians actually call this a Japanese strategic victory. Think about that for a moment. The Japanese lost Kiska without fighting, and yet it was a victory. Why? Because the Japanese successfully evacuated their troops. They didn't get trapped. They didn't lose their garrison to American firepower. They had to abandon their position, yes, but they saved their soldiers. The Battle of Attu had been so costly, so brutal, that when it came to Kiska, the Japanese High Command decided that defending the position was not worth the lives it would cost. They made a cold calculation: lose the island, save the men. It was pragmatic. It was smart militarily. And from the Japanese perspective, it made sense. But here's what's interesting about the occupation of Kiska. Some American soldiers, landing on what they believed would be a heavily defended island, were trigger-happy. They were nervous. They were expecting combat. There were friendly fire incidents. American soldiers sometimes fired on each other in the confusion and fog. There were casualties caused, not by Japanese defenders, but by American soldiers shooting their own men. This is a lesser-known aspect of the Aleutian Campaign that often gets left out of historical accounts. The psychological toll of expecting combat, of being hyped up for battle and then finding nothing and then accidentally shooting your own people. It's a different kind of trauma. It's confusion, mixed with guilt, mixed with relief. With Kiska secured and Attu already taken, the Aleutian Islands Campaign was essentially over. The Japanese presence in the Aleutians had been eliminated or evacuated. American control of the islands was secure. From a strategic standpoint, the purpose of the campaign had been achieved. But what was that purpose exactly? This is where things get interesting. This is where things get interesting. The campaign cost thousands of lives. Thousands more were injured. Hundreds of soldiers suffered from cold-related injuries that would affect them for the rest of their lives. The operation consumed enormous resources: ships, aircraft, ammunition, supplies. And in the grand scheme of World War II, the Aleutian Islands Campaign had almost no impact on the war's ultimate outcome. The Japanese were never going to use these islands to invade the North American mainland. They were never going to use them as staging grounds for attacks on Canada or the continental US. The strategic importance that military planners had feared turned out to be largely theoretical. Or if I told you that the entire Aleutian Campaign might have been unnecessary? That's a controversial statement, but is actually supported by some modern military historians. The campaign was partly driven by political pressure. President Roosevelt wanted to show that no Japanese attack on American soil would go unanswered. The campaign was partly driven by military ambition. Commanders wanted to prove that the army could handle Arctic warfare. But was it militarily necessary? Did it change the trajectory of the war? Did it achieve anything that couldn't have been achieved through a purely defensive strategy, or even through a blockade that would have starved out the Japanese garrisons without direct combat? These are questions that historians still debate today. Section 6, The Human Coast, Heroes and Forgotten Names, 4,305 200 words. But let's take a step back from military strategy and talk about people. Because that's what this campaign was really about. It was about thousands of individual men, most of them just teenagers and young adults, thrust into impossible circumstances. There were heroes in the Aleutian Campaign, real heroes, men who performed extraordinary acts of courage in extraordinary circumstances. One of them was Private, First Class, Joe Martinez. He was a young soldier from New Mexico, assigned to a rifle company on Attu. During one battle, his unit was pinned down by Japanese machine gun fire. The machine gun position was in a fortified bunker. The position was well hidden and well defended. American troops were dying, and the machine gun fire wasn't stopping. Martinez, acting on instinct or training, or just raw courage, decided to move forward. He crawled across open ground, under fire, toward the Japanese position. He did this knowing that he was probably going to die. Oi. Was menace. Knowing that machine gun fire was tearing the ground up around him, but he kept moving. When he reached the bunker, he threw a grenade through the opening. The explosion killed the Japanese soldiers inside. The machine gun went silent. The American advance continued. Martinez survived. He was recommended for the Medal of Honor. He lived the rest of his life knowing that his action had saved the lives of his comrades. Most people have never heard of him. There were hundreds of stories like this. Stories of medics running through gunfire to reach wounded soldiers. Stories of machine gunners holding positions against repeated assaults. Stories of officers making decisions in impossible situations, trying to minimize casualties while still completing the mission. There were also stories of suffering that had nothing to do with combat. One soldier wrote in his diary about watching his friend develop severe frostbite. The friend's fingers turned black. His toes died. He was evacuated to a hospital, but the damage was permanent. He spent the rest of his life without fingers on his left hand. He was 19 years old. Another soldier described the smell of gangrene. A wounded man couldn't be evacuated due to weather. The infection set in. The smell was overwhelming. A sweet, rotting smell that got into your clothes and wouldn't come out. The soldier died 3 days later, well within hearing distance of the medics who couldn't reach him in time because the weather had made the terrain impassable. These are the stories that don't make it into official military histories. These are the human stories. The stories of young men enduring things that shouldn't be endured. There were also stories of breakdown. Combat fatigue, what we'd now call PTSD, affected thousands of soldiers in the Aleutian Campaign. Some soldiers simply couldn't continue. They broke down. They stopped functioning. Some had to be evacuated because they were no longer mentally capable of serving. There was no shame in this, but it happened. The psychological toll of the conditions, the fear, the violence, it was too much for some men. But the vast majority of soldiers kept going. They endured. They did their duty. They came home. Those who came home changed. Many struggled with the memories for the rest of their lives. Some never talked about what they experienced. It was too painful, too traumatic. Too impossible to put into words that made sense to people who hadn't been there. The weather, which we've talked about extensively, was itself a form of combat. Medical records from the campaign document cases of hypothermia, frostbite, immersion foot, and other cold-related injuries that were sometimes more debilitating than combat wounds. A soldier with a bullet wound had a chance. Medical care could save him. But a soldier with severe frostbite might lose fingers, toes, parts of limbs. These injuries didn't kill you immediately, but they ruined your life. Think about that. You're a young man. You fight for your country. You survive enemy combat. But the cold is relentless. Frostbite sets in, and for the rest of your life, you can't feel certain parts of your body. You can't work certain jobs. You struggle with phantom pain, with numbness that never quite goes away, with the knowledge that you lost a piece of yourself on some frozen island most people have never heard of. The saddest part, many of these men, when they came home, found that their sacrifice was completely unknown. The Aleutian Campaign barely made the news. While D-Day happened and was covered extensively, while the Pacific Island hopping campaign was getting attention, the Aleutian Campaign was happening in the shadows. Veterans of Attu and Kiska came home, and people didn't know what they were talking about. The Aleutian Islands? Where's that? People knew about Pearl Harbor, people knew about Guadalcanal, but Attu... Those islands were too remote, too insignificant in the public imagination. Whoa! This might be the greatest tragedy of the Aleutian Campaign, not the deaths and injuries themselves, but the fact that the survivors' sacrifices were forgotten. If you're still with me at this point in the narrative, you're understanding why I opened this script the way I did. This isn't just a war story. This is about a nation's vulnerability. This is about how quickly things can change. This is about how young people get caught up in events larger than themselves, and sometimes their contributions to history get erased. Section 7, Straight Chick Failure, or Necessary Response. 5. 1,200, 900 words. Let's talk about something that's been bothering military historians and analysts for 80 years. Was the Aleutian Islands Campaign necessary? From a pure military strategy standpoint, the campaign seems questionable. Japan never intended to use the Aleutians as a springboard for invasion of the continental United States. Japan didn't have the industrial capacity or the naval resources to mount such an invasion. The Aleutians were, militarily, a strategic dead end. They were isolated. They were difficult to supply. They were impossibly far from any Japanese production centers. So why did Japan take them in the first place? The answer is political and psychological more than military. The Japanese wanted to show that they could strike America. They wanted to prove that American territory wasn't safe. They wanted to distract American military planners and resources from other theaters where Japan was actually trying to achieve decisive victory. It almost worked. It succeeded in forcing America to respond. But the response, while necessary from a political standpoint, was questionable from a military efficiency standpoint. What if America had simply chosen not to retake the islands? This is a controversial what if, but it's worth considering. If America had chosen to bypass the Aleutians, to leave them in Japanese hands, but simply quarantine them, preventing any Japanese offensive operations while focusing all resources on the Pacific War, what would have been different? The Japanese garrisons would have eventually been cut off by American naval power. They would have been starved out. They would have been eliminated without the cost of the Attu campaign. American resources could have been focused on operations that directly contributed to the defeat of Japan, operations in the Central Pacific, operations in the Southwest Pacific, operations that were strategically decisive. But here's the counter-argument. From a psychological and political standpoint, it was important for America to respond immediately and decisively to a Japanese invasion of American soil. Allowing Japanese forces to occupy American territory, even if those forces were eventually neutralized, would have been politically damaging. It would have suggested that America was weak, that Japanese attacks on American soil could be tolerated, that the American government couldn't protect its citizens. The Battle of Attu, while strategically questionable, was politically necessary. It demonstrated American resolve. It showed the American people and the world that any Japanese aggression against American territory would be met with overwhelming force. This is a recurring tension in military strategy, the difference between what's militarily optimal and what's politically necessary. Sometimes the two align, sometimes they don't. In the case of the Aleutian Islands Campaign, they didn't align perfectly. Or the campaign was politically necessary, but militarily questionable, and the cost was thousands of lives. Modern military analysts have used the Aleutian Campaign as a case study in this exact problem. If you're leading a country, you can't always do the militarily optimal thing. You have to consider the political consequences. You have to consider the message you're sending to your citizens, your allies, and your enemies. What if I told you that this same dilemma faces modern militaries today? Think about the decisions that military and political leaders are constantly making. Constantly making. What interventions are militarily justified but politically unpopular? What interventions are militarily questionable but politically demanded? Where do we draw the line? The Aleutian Islands Campaign teaches us that there's no easy answer. Sometimes the right decision from a pure military strategy standpoint isn't the right decision when you consider all the factors. And sometimes the cost of a politically necessary decision is higher than anyone anticipated. Section 8. The Larger War. Context. 6,600 words. Words. To truly understand the Aleutian Islands Campaign, you have to understand what else was happening in the war at the same time. When Attu was being fought in May 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic was still ongoing. German U-boats were sinking American supply ships. The North African campaign had just concluded with an American victory. Plans were underway for Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, which would happen in July 1943. In the Pacific, American forces were in the midst of the island-hopping campaign. Guadalcanal had been secured. American forces were fighting in New Guinea. The Central Pacific Drive, which would eventually lead to Iwo Jima and Okinawa, was still being planned. The Aleutian Campaign, in this context, was small. It involved fewer troops than Operation Husky. It had less strategic impact than the Central Pacific operations. It was a sideshow in many ways. But it was a sideshow with lessons. The Battle of Attu showed American commanders several important things about Arctic warfare. It showed them how difficult it was to maintain supply lines in extreme climates. It showed them the psychological toll of extreme environmental conditions. It showed them the logistical complexity of operating far from established bases. Some of these lessons would prove relevant later. When American forces operated in the winter in Europe, particularly during the Battle of the Bulge in late 1944 and early 1945, commanders had the experience from Alaska to draw upon. Not directly, because the conditions were different, but the principles were similar. The Aleutian Campaign had taught lessons about managing troops in extreme cold, about supply challenges in difficult terrain, about maintaining morale in harsh environments. The campaign also showed the adaptability of the American military. The American forces in Alaska started out unprepared for Arctic warfare. But through the course of the campaign, they learned, they adapted, they developed techniques and procedures that allowed them to operate effectively in the extreme environment. This was the American military, at its best learning, adapting, improving. This adaptability would be crucial in the Pacific War. As American forces moved toward Japan, they had to adapt to jungle warfare, to amphibious operations, to defending against kamikazes, to clearing heavily fortified islands. The Aleutian Campaign, while not teaching these specific skills, taught the larger lesson that American forces could adapt to new and challenging environments. There's also an interesting comparison between the Aleutian Campaign and what the Japanese military was simultaneously doing. The Japanese military, for all its skill and courage, was becoming increasingly rigid. The no retreat doctrine meant that Japanese commanders often made decisions that were tactically unsound because retreat was culturally unacceptable. The Japanese were losing because they couldn't adapt their strategy as the war progressed. American military culture, by contrast, was more flexible. American commanders could make decisions based on military logic rather than cultural codes of honor. American forces could retreat when necessary. American strategy could adapt to new circumstances. This flexibility was ultimately far more effective than the Japanese rigid adherence to codes of honor. The Aleutian Campaign embodied this difference. The American decision to fight in extremely difficult circumstances, win, and then move on, was driven by military logic. The Japanese decision to fight to the death on Attu, even when the tactical situation was hopeless, was driven by cultural codes of honor. Which approach was more effective? Clearly, the American approach. But the question remains, was the Aleutian Campaign worth the lives it cost? This is the question that haunted some of the commanders involved. General Simon Buckner, who commanded the Alaska operation, eventually expressed doubts about whether the campaign had been worth its cost. He would later command forces in the Pacific and died in combat on Okinawa in 1945. But the doubts he expressed about the Aleutian Campaign stayed with military theorists. Section 9, Legacy and Lessons, 6,600, 7,400 words. The Aleutian Islands Campaign ended in the fall of 1943. American forces secured the islands. Japanese forces were eliminated or evacuated. American control of the entire Aleutian chain was established, but the legacy of the campaign extended far beyond 1943. First, there's the infrastructure legacy. The campaign required American forces to build bases in Alaska. These bases, airfields, harbors, supply depots, became permanent installations. After the war, Alaska remained strategically important. With the beginning of the Cold War and the Soviet Union as a new adversary, Alaska took on even greater strategic significance. The Aleutian Islands became important not as a threat to American soil, but as part of the early warning system for Soviet aircraft. The proximity to the Soviet Union made Alaska crucial for detecting incoming Soviet bombers. The Aleutian Islands chain became part of America's continental defense system. Second, there's the technological legacy. The extreme conditions in the Aleutians forced the development of better cold weather equipment, better aircraft de-icing systems, better cold weather lubricants for engines. These technologies had applications far beyond military use. Civilian aviation, Arctic exploration, and industrial applications in cold climates all benefited from research driven by the military needs identified during the Aleutian Campaign. Third, there's the doctrinal legacy. Military strategists studied the campaign intensely. The lessons about Arctic warfare, about supply lines in extreme environments, about maintaining morale in harsh conditions, these became part of military doctrine. Every military academy includes study of the Aleutian Campaign. The campaign raised important questions about the relationship between military necessity and political necessity. It raised questions about the true strategic importance of remote territories. It raised questions about the cost-benefit analysis in military operations. But perhaps the most important legacy is a human one. The Aleutian Campaign taught America about its own vulnerability. Yes, America had the advantage of distance. America wasn't under threat of conventional invasion. That was clear even in 1942. But the fact that Japan could strike American soil, that Japanese forces could establish themselves on American territory, that it would take a major military effort to dislodge them, this was a shock to the American sense of security. And that lesson remains relevant today. America remains geographically isolated. America still has advantages of distance from potential adversaries. But the Aleutian Campaign reminds us that isolation is not invulnerability. Remote territories can be contested. Adversaries with sufficient resources and determination can strike far from home. In the modern era, this lesson takes on new meanings. With missiles, drones, and cyber warfare, the concept of striking American soil has evolved. But the fundamental lesson remains: no territory, no matter how remote, can be taken for granted. No American possession can be assumed safe or thugged. Think about this in the context of Alaska today. Alaska remains strategically important. It's the closest American territory to Russia. It remains part of America's continental defense system. In a potential future conflict with Russia, Alaska would again be contested territory. The Aleutian Campaign of 1942-1943 would be studied as the precedent for how to defend such territory. What if I told you that military strategists are currently planning for potential conflict in the Arctic? That's not science fiction. That's current military planning. As climate change makes the Arctic more accessible, as new shipping routes open through Arctic waters, the strategic importance of the Arctic increases. Alaska and the Aleutian Islands are right in the middle of these considerations. The Aleutian Campaign of 80 years ago might actually be a preview of future conflicts. While Not in the specific details, the tactics and technology are different, but in the fundamental strategic picture, competing powers vying for control of remote Arctic territory. SE Section 10, forgotten for a reason. ASI, word, U7, 400, 8,200 words. We've been asking throughout this script why the Aleutian Campaign has been largely forgotten by history. Let's really dig into that question now. The campaign is barely mentioned in popular histories of World War II. It's not featured prominently in documentaries. It's not a major topic in school curricula. Why? One reason is simple. It was small. In terms of total casualties, the Aleutian Campaign was a blip on the radar of the Second World War. The Battle of Attu saw roughly 1,500 American casualties. That was significant, but it wasn't anywhere near the scale of major battles. D-Day had nearly 300,000 casualties in a matter of weeks. The Battle of the Bulge had over 600,000 casualties. The Pacific Island campaigns saw hundreds of thousands of casualties. By comparison, the Aleutian campaign was small. The strategic impact was minimal. The news value was limited. When you're covering a war that involves millions of people, thousands of battles, countless theatres of operation, it's easy for smaller campaigns to get lost. Another reason is geographic. The Aleutian Islands are remote. They were remote in 1943, and they're still remote today. Most Americans have never been there. Most Americans couldn't find them on a map. It's hard for people to emotionally invest in a campaign set in a place they've never heard of and couldn't locate. Compare that to D-Day or the Battle of Iwo Jima. These are places that entered the American consciousness. Even people who've never been to France can visualize the beaches of Normandy. Even people who've never been to the Pacific know the name Iwo Jima. But the Aleutian Islands, they're just abstract names on a map. There's also a cultural reason. The Aleutian Campaign didn't fit the narrative of the war that Americans preferred to tell themselves. Americans wanted stories of triumph, of good defeating evil, of American power being decisive and clean. The Aleutian Campaign was messy. It was unclear whether the campaign was militarily necessary. It involved significant American casualties. It involved terrible environmental conditions and hardship. D-Day fit the narrative. American forces landing in Europe to liberate it from Nazi tyranny. Clear moral story. Clear victory. The Aleutian Campaign didn't fit that narrative as cleanly, so it got pushed to the margins. But here's where it gets interesting. Maybe we've forgotten it for a reason that matters. The Aleutian Campaign wasn't glorious. It wasn't clear-cut. It was a campaign where thousands of young men suffered and died for objectives that, in hindsight, were strategically questionable. It was a campaign that revealed American vulnerability. It was a campaign that raised uncomfortable questions about how war is managed, how resources are allocated, how decisions are made that affect people's lives. And maybe America preferred not to think about those uncomfortable questions. In 1943, while the Aleutian Campaign was ongoing, there was actual criticism of it in military circles. Officers questioned whether the resources being spent on Alaska could be better used elsewhere. There were debates about whether the political cost of not retaking the Aleutians would be greater than the military cost of retaking them. But these debates were largely classified. They happened in military circles and weren't broadcast to the American public. The campaign, when it was covered in the press, was presented as a necessary operation against Japanese invaders. The doubts and questions were suppressed or set aside. After the war, when everything was declassified and open for historical examination, the uncomfortable questions remained. Modern historians have revisited the Aleutian Campaign and asked, was this campaign strategically necessary? Could it have been avoided? Should America have made different decisions? These questions are harder to answer confidently than the narrative that Japan invaded American soil and America responded. They're questions that don't have clean answers. And for a nation that wanted to celebrate its World War II victory unambiguously, these questions weren't comfortable. So the Aleutian Campaign became forgotten, not because it was unimportant, but because it was too important in ways America didn't want to confront. It was a reminder that even in America's greatest hour, even when facing clear threats, decisions were made that were questionable. Resources were allocated in ways that were debatable. Young people died for purposes that weren't entirely clear. This is mature history. This is the kind of historical understanding that comes with accepting that even when you're right, even when you're fighting against evil, the details are messy. The decisions are complicated. The costs are real and shouldn't be minimized. We find a seventh see that west do we is drink something choose. Section 11. Modern Parallels and Warnings. 8C 200, 8C 900 words. Let me bring this forward to today, because the lessons of the Aleutian Campaign are more relevant now than ever. First, there's the geographic vulnerability question. America prides itself on safety through distance. We're protected by two oceans. Our adversaries are far away. But technology has changed the meaning of far away. When Japan attacked the Aleutians in 1942, they had to send ships and soldiers physically to those islands. Today, an adversary could strike across oceans without physical presence. Missiles, drones, cyber attacks. These don't care about distance the way physical armies do. The Aleutian Campaign reminds us that geographic security is relative. It depends on the technological capabilities of potential adversaries. As those capabilities change, as missiles become longer range, as drones become more sophisticated, the meaning of American security changes. Consider this. What if a future adversary, let's say China, decided to test American resolve in a remote territory? What if they attempted to occupy a small island or atoll in the Pacific that America claims? Would America respond militarily? Would the response be disproportionate or appropriate? These aren't hypothetical questions. Military strategists are thinking about exactly this scenario, and when they do, they often reference the Aleutian Campaign as a precedent. Second, there's the resource allocation question. How? No, I. The Aleutian Campaign consumed enormous resources: ships, aircraft, fuel, troops that could have been used elsewhere. This forced military leadership to make difficult choices about priorities. Today, America faces similar choices. Defense budgets are finite. Military capabilities are finite. The question of where to concentrate resources, where to defend, what to prioritize, these are perennial questions. The Aleutian Campaign teaches us that these questions don't have obvious answers. Sometimes the politically correct answer, we must defend every inch of American territory, might not be the strategically optimal answer. but the politically correct answer might still be necessary for reasons of credibility, deterrence, and national psychology. Think about this in the context of Ukraine and Russia. Russia invaded Ukraine. America and NATO responded by supporting Ukraine with weapons and training. But we didn't directly intervene militarily. Why? Because direct military intervention would escalate the conflict dangerously. But this created a credibility problem. If Russia believed that America wouldn't respond militarily to Russian aggression in one place, might Russia feel emboldened to act elsewhere? This is exactly the kind of calculation that was being made in 1942. If America didn't respond to the Japanese invasion of the Aleutians, would Japan feel emboldened to attempt other invasions? Would America's credibility be damaged? These questions transcend eras. They're fundamental questions about how power is exercised, how deterrence works, how credibility is maintained. Third, there's the environmental resilience question. The Aleutian Campaign showed that extreme environments are challenging for military operations. This is becoming more relevant as the Arctic warms and becomes accessible. Climate change is opening up Arctic waters, Arctic territories, Arctic resources that were previously inaccessible. Russia is investing heavily in Arctic military capabilities. China is expressing interest in Arctic resources and routes. America is being forced to pay attention to an Arctic theatre that it ignored for decades. When America does so, commanders will study the Aleutian Campaign. They'll look at how logistics work in extreme environments. They'll look at how to maintain morale and operational effectiveness in harsh conditions. They'll look at the lessons learned from 1942-1943 to inform 2024 and beyond planning. Here's the really unsettling part. The Aleutian Campaign showed that America is capable of responding to threats to its territory, but it also showed that the response is difficult, expensive, and generates casualties. If America's adversaries understand this, if they understand that striking American territory will provoke a response that's costly in blood and treasure, they might still calculate that the strategic benefit of the strike outweighs the cost of the response. This is what analysts call raising the costs of response. If the Aleutian Campaign had been far more costly, if American casualties had been much higher, would America have still retaken the islands? Would the political will have persisted? The Japanese, in invading the Aleutians, were calculating exactly this. They were calculating that America might respond with overwhelming force, but that the political will to sustain that response in a remote location might eventually erode. They were partially right. The Aleutian Campaign was never a priority. It was treated as a secondary theatre. Resources were allocated elsewhere. The campaign only happened because political pressure forced it. What would have happened if Japan had invested more resources into holding the Aleutians? What if they'd made the campaign so costly that American political will to continue wavered? This is speculative history, but it's worth asking. And it's worth asking because the same calculation could apply to future conflicts. War. Section 12, the veteran's story, were 9,400 words. Let me tell you something personal about the veterans of the Aleutian Campaign. Most of them never sought recognition. They came home from the war, went about their lives, and largely stayed quiet about what they experienced. Some got jobs, some went to college on the GI Bill, some struggled with what we'd now call PTSD, though nobody called it that at the time. Some thrived, some barely survived. There was a particular phenomenon among Aleutian veterans. Many of them developed health problems related to their service that persisted for decades. Cold-related injuries that never quite healed properly. Infections picked up in the Arctic that resurfaced years later. Psychological issues that manifested as depression, anxiety, or difficulty maintaining relationships. Some veterans tried to talk about their experiences. They'd mention the Aleutians at a dinner party or a bar, and they'd see the blank stares. The Aleutians, where are those? Why were you there? It was isolating. The general American consciousness wasn't holding space for their experience. The war was celebrated, but the specific campaigns that individual soldiers participated in were often forgotten. There's a veteran named, let's call him Robert, because many of these men have passed away, and I want to be respectful, who served on Kiska and Attu. Robert joined the army when he was 18. He was trained in basic infantry skills, assigned to a unit, and shipped to Alaska. He spent his 19th birthday in a barracks in Anchorage. On his 20th birthday, he was in the Arctic fighting Japanese soldiers. After the war, he never wanted to talk about it, not because he was trying to hide anything, but because it hurt too much. The memories were too vivid. He had nightmares for decades. He had difficulty sleeping. He struggled in relationships because he couldn't quite explain to his wife or friends why certain things, the cold, certain smells, loud noises, would trigger intense anxiety. When Robert was in his 70s, he attended a historical reenactment of the Battle of Attu, all row. There were younger people there, interested in learning about this forgotten campaign. For the first time in 50 years, Robert talked openly about his experience. He described the cold that was so intense it was almost alive. He described the fear of combat mixed with the fear of freezing. He described watching friends die and being unable to do anything about it. He described the relief when the battle ended, mixed with the sorrow for those who hadn't survived. Oh! When he finished speaking, several younger people came up to him with tears in their eyes. They thanked him. They said they finally understood. They said they were sorry his sacrifice had been forgotten. Robert said something that sticks with me. I didn't fight so people would remember me. I fought because my country needed me. But I won't lie, it's nice to be remembered. There are hundreds of stories like Robert's. Men who survived the campaign, lived their lives, and gradually came to terms with what they experienced. Some of them were able to talk about it. Some of them never were. Many have passed away, taking their stories with them into history. The tragedy of these forgotten stories is that they represent real human experience that's now lost. The specific details of what it was like to be a 19-year-old soldier in the Arctic, facing combat in a place most Americans had never heard of, that's gone. The personal resilience, The human adaptability, the way people coped with impossible circumstances, much of that is lost. But some of it remains. Archives contain letters and diaries from soldiers who participated in the campaign. Oral histories preserve the voices of veterans recounting their experiences. Military records document the operational details. Well, laugh. These fragments remain, available to anyone willing to seek them out. If you ever get the chance to speak with a veteran, any veteran, ask them about their service. Ask them what they experienced. Ask them how it changed them. Ask them what they want to be remembered for. These conversations are precious. They're direct connections to history. They're the voices of people who lived through extraordinary times. The Aleutian Campaign veterans are aging now. Most are in their 90s. Within a generation, there will be no living survivors of the campaign. The last direct connection to this piece of history will be gone. SC Section 13. Our Reflection and Modern. Warning C. 9,400, 9,700 words. As we near the end of this narrative, I want you to reflect on something. The Aleutian Islands Campaign happened because an enemy, the Japanese military, decided to test American resolve by attacking American territory. The Japanese didn't expect to conquer America. They didn't expect to hold the islands indefinitely. They were testing. They were probing. They were trying to force America to allocate resources to a remote theatre when those resources might be better used elsewhere. It worked. Japan successfully distracted American military planners and forced them to commit resources to the Aleutians. Whether that was strategically beneficial for Japan or not is debatable, but it certainly diverted American attention and resources. Now ask yourself, what does this teach us about vulnerability? It teaches us that vulnerability isn't just about direct threats. It's about the potential for an adversary to force you to respond to provocations that might not be in your strategic interest to respond to. It's about the tension between credibility and strategic rationality. If you're a powerful country and an adversary attacks your territory, even remote territory, can you choose not to respond? What are the costs of not responding? What are the costs of responding? These are the questions that the Aleutian Campaign raises, and they're still relevant today. Let me ask you something more directly. If a near-peer competitor, China, Russia, or someone else decided to test American resolve by seizing a remote American possession or territory, what would America do? The answer isn't obvious. The political pressure to respond militarily would be enormous, but the strategic case for responding militarily might be weak. Yet failing to respond would damage American credibility. Allies would question whether American security guarantees mean anything. Adversaries would question whether America would truly defend its interests. The psychological message would be, America won't fight for remote territories. Is that a message any great power can afford to send? This is why the Aleutian Campaign remains relevant. It was, in many ways, a losing situation for America. America had to respond for political and credibility reasons. The response was costly, strategically questionable, and involved significant bloodshed. America solved the problem, but at a cost that might not have been necessary. Modern America faces similar dilemmas. Taiwan, a remote island democracy that many Americans can't locate on a map, has become a central focus of American security policy. Why? Because of credibility. Because allies need to believe America will fight for them, fight for them. Because adversaries need to believe America won't allow conquest of strategic locations. Yet defending Taiwan would be extraordinarily difficult. It would be costly. It might not be strategically optimal, but not defending Taiwan would shatter American credibility in Asia. It would be seen as abandonment of a key ally. It would potentially trigger regional realignment that would disadvantage American interests. This is the same dilemma America faced in the Aleutians. Respond, and it's costly and strategically questionable. Don't respond, and credibility is damaged. There's no good option, only choices between different types of costs. The Aleutian Campaign is a case study in how to navigate this dilemma. America responded militarily. America absorbed the costs. America got the islands back. In the long run, this preserved American credibility, which proved essential for what came after the final victory in the Pacific and then the Cold War. But the campaign asks a question. Is there a better way to navigate this dilemma? Military strategists have been asking this question for 80 years, and they haven't come up with a definitive answer. Because the problem is inherent to being a great power. You have commitments, you have interests, you have credibility that depends on defending those interests. But defending those interests is always costly. SC Section 14. Conclusion. Why remember? Remember 9,710,000 words. As we conclude this narrative about the Aleutian Islands Campaign, I want to return to a basic question. Why should we remember this? Why should we spend time thinking about a battle that happened over 80 years ago, on islands that most people have never heard of, involving strategic objectives that modern analysts debate whether were even necessary? The answer is profound. We remember the Aleutian Campaign because it teaches us about the nature of power, vulnerability, and choice in an uncertain world. We remember it because it honors the sacrifice of thousands of young people who endured unspeakable conditions to defend their country. We remember it because it raises uncomfortable questions about how nations make decisions under pressure. We remember it because the lessons it contains are still applicable today. In fact, they're more applicable now than ever. As the Arctic warms and becomes contested, as China rises as a peer competitor, as Russia seeks to reassert itself in territories it considers part of its sphere of influence, as technology changes the meaning of distance and security, the Aleutian Campaign is a warning. It's a reminder that no territory is so remote that it can be taken for granted. It's a reminder that credibility matters more than raw military power. It's a reminder that young people will be asked to sacrifice for objectives that might not be perfectly clear to them. It's a reminder that war is messy, costly, and sometimes strategically ambiguous. The campaign is also a source of inspiration. It's inspiring because American forces, facing impossible conditions, adapted and succeeded. American soldiers, dealing with cold and fear and danger, persevered. American leadership, facing strategic uncertainty, made decisions and committed to seeing them through. American resilience, The ability to endure hardship and keep moving forward was on display. This resilience is part of the American character. It's something that's often been forgotten in recent decades, as America has enjoyed prosperity and military superiority. But the Aleutian Campaign reminds us that it's there. That when tested, Americans can endure, Americans can adapt, Americans can overcome. For modern viewers watching this, the lesson is your world is more fragile than you think. You benefit from peace and security that millions of people fought to establish and maintain. You live in comfort that would have seemed impossible to your grandparents' generation. You have opportunities that billions of people lack. But this peace, this security, this comfort, it's not guaranteed. It requires constant defense. It requires vigilance. It requires people willing to serve in difficult places, under terrible conditions, for purposes that aren't always entirely clear. The veterans of the Aleutian Campaign understood this. They went where they were sent. They did what was asked of them. Many of them paid prices that lasted for the rest of their lives. Most of them never got recognition. Most of them are forgotten. But they shouldn't be. They should be remembered, not as heroes necessarily, though many acted heroically, but as people who served their country during its darkest hour and made sacrifices that enabled the freedom we enjoy today. The real warning of the Aleutian Campaign is this. Peace is not the default state of human affairs. Security is not guaranteed. Freedom is defended by constant effort and sacrifice. If we forget the people who made that sacrifice, if we lose the lessons they learned through their suffering, we're putting ourselves at risk. We're forgetting the price of the world we've inherited. So remember the Aleutian Islands Campaign. Remember Attu and Kiska. Remember the names of soldiers whose sacrifice was forgotten. Remember that America has been tested before, in places you've never heard of, by circumstances that seemed impossibly difficult. And remember that when tested again, and we will be tested again, these same principles apply. We will need resilience. We will need adaptation. We will need people willing to serve and sacrifice. We will need clear thinking about what we're defending and why. The Aleutian Islands Campaign was the forgotten battle of World War II. But it shouldn't be forgotten. It shouldn't be relegated to history textbooks that almost nobody reads. It should be studied. It should be taught. It should be remembered as a profound lesson about vulnerability, resilience, and the cost of maintaining power and credibility in an uncertain world. Your freedom today was purchased by people whose names you'll never know, in places you'll never visit, enduring hardships you can barely imagine. That's worth remembering. That's worth honoring. That's worth learning from. Final call to action. If you made it this far, you understand something that most people don't. You understand that history isn't just stories about the past. It's a mirror for the future. It's a guide for understanding the choices we face today. I urge you, share this story. Tell people about the Aleutian Islands Campaign. Look up the names of veterans if you can find them. Read their letters and diaries, understand their sacrifice, and most importantly, think critically about the lessons this campaign teaches us. Think about what vulnerabilities exist in your own world. Think about what sacrifices others are making to defend your freedom and security. Subscribe for more histories that matter. Comment with what you think about this campaign. Tell me, what empire do you fear next? What territories do you think will be contested? What lessons from history do you think are most relevant to our future? The past is never truly past. It's always instructing the present, warning us, teaching us. The Aleutian Islands Campaign ended in 1943, but its lessons are alive today. Let's not forget them.